Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deep dive. If you're prepping for those UPSC exams, you got to keep up with what's changing in India's economy and agriculture. It's absolutely essential, especially for those daily UPSC mains current affairs. Today, we're really going deep on this USDA report and checking out what could happen with U.S. trade.
Yeah, this is all about helping you understand a super important intersection, where India's agricultural policies, its economic growth, and its place in the global scene all kind of come together. And this is the kind of stuff that's going to be super valuable for both mains and even prelims.
We're on a mission today, a pretty straightforward one, really. We want to pull out those core insights from this USDA report, and we're zeroing in on India's need for animal feed, corn and soybeans specifically. And then there's this whole thing with cotton production, which has taken a really interesting turn, and we got to talk about why the U.S. is so focused on getting more into our markets.
We're working with some solid information here, too. Our main source is a recent analysis in the Hindu, so it's reliable stuff. We're going to break it all down and get to the essential understanding of what's going on in India's farm sector and how it fits into the international market. It's about building that in-depth perspective that's so crucial for your analysis in those exams.
All right, let's jump right in. The USDA report is pointing out something pretty big. India's need for animal feed is going up. They're projecting a big increase in the demand for ingredients like corn and soybean, especially as we head into the early 2030s. What's the main reason for this?
Well, the report really emphasizes the expected surge in demand for animal products, milk, eggs, fish meat. This is directly connected to India's population growth and, most importantly, the rising income levels. As those incomes go up, diets tend to change, and that often means more protein-rich foods.
That makes sense. More people with more buying power probably means more of these items getting consumed. Do we know what the current consumption levels in India look like, just to get an idea of how big the shift could be?
We do. Back in 2020, the per capita consumption of these animal products in India was about 82.6 kilos. But to put that in perspective, the global average is much higher at 143 kilos. If we break it down even further, milk consumption in India was around 66.3 kilos per person. Fish was at 7.9, eggs at 3.9, and chicken at 2.6 kilos. So while production and consumption are on the rise, there's definitely a lot of room for them to grow to reach those global averages.
And is the production of these animal products actually going up significantly? The report talks about some pretty impressive annual growth figures.
Yes, absolutely. The production data really shows this rising demand.
Yeah.
We're looking at yearly growth rates of 8.5% for chicken, 5.8% for eggs, 5.1% for bovine meat, and a steady 5% for milk. This constant growth on the supply side naturally pushes the need for more feed to support these animals.
Right. So let's talk specifically about corn and soybean, those main feed ingredients. What's the USDA predicting for their consumption in India?
If we're talking about rapid income growth, which is definitely a real possibility for India, the projected increases are pretty dramatic. For corn, consumption is expected to jump from 34.7 million tons in 2022-23 to a whopping 98 million tons by 2040, and then even further up to 200.2 million tons by 2050. Soybean meal is going to follow a similar path, going up from 6.2 million tons in 2022-23 to 30.9 million tons by 2040 and hitting 68.3 million tons by 2050. What's really interesting here isn't just how big those increases are, but how fast this demand is expected to shoot up.
Those are some major jumps, and it makes you wonder if India can keep up with this growing demand on its own, or if we're going to have to depend more on imports.
The report's suggesting that India is probably going to need to up its imports, especially if that rapid income growth happens. By 2040, the projected import needs for corn are about 46 million tons, and for soybean meal, it's 19 million tons. And looking even further out to 2050, those numbers climb to a significant 134 million tons of corn and 53 million tons of soybean meal. Even if we consider a more moderate income growth scenario, India would still probably have to import something like 11 million tons of corn and 6 million tons of soybean meal by 2040. So yeah, it really raises questions about whether India can stay self-sufficient in these key areas in the future.
So right now, India is not importing much of these feed commodities, is it? The report mentions a figure for 2022.
Yeah, in 2022, India only imported about 178,969 tons of feed commodities. This really shows how the USDA sees India as a market with huge potential for growth in this area in the coming years. You've got this stark contrast between the current low import volume and the projected massive increase in demand, and that points to a potentially significant shift in how India handles agricultural trade.
Okay, so clearly the U.S. is watching this very closely. This brings us to our second main point. The U.S. push for more access to the Indian market, especially with these recent threats about reciprocal tariffs. What's the story there?
Well, we've seen the U.S. president talking about the possibility of putting reciprocal tariffs on things we import from India, potentially starting in early April. These kinds of moves are often a part of a bigger strategy, to encourage or pressure a trading partner to open up its markets more to the exports from the country that's initiating this whole thing. In this case, the U.S. is really interested in exporting more corn, soybean, and cotton to India.
So basically, if the U.S. raises tariffs on stuff from India, there's a chance India might hit back by raising tariffs on stuff from the U.S. Is that the main idea?
Exactly. It's a tool in the world of international trade negotiations. And these agricultural products are big exports for the U.S., aren't they? The report gives us some pretty big numbers on their export value.
Yeah, they're really important for the U.S. economy. In 2022, the combined value of U.S. global shipments of corn, soybean, and cotton peaked at $62 billion. These sectors are major economic drivers for them.
Right. And the report also mentions that China, a major buyer of these U.S. commodities, has been scaling back on its purchases. How do you think that plays into the U.S. interest in the Indian market?
Well, that's a key part of this whole situation. With China, who's historically been a huge importer of U.S. agricultural products, reducing its intake for various reasons, the U.S. is actively looking for other markets and trying to expand into existing ones. India, with its growing demand for feed and its current need to import cotton, looks like a pretty attractive opportunity to make up for some of that lost demand from China.
So the U.S. definitely sees India as a promising market. But what's stopping them from fully taking advantage of this potential, especially when it comes to corn and soybean?
This is where we run into those barriers that are preventing the U.S. from getting into the Indian market easily. We're talking about tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers.
On the tariff side, India's currently got a pretty hefty 45% customs duty on imported soybean and a substantial 50% duty on imported corn. Those high tariffs make U.S. imports way more expensive for Indian buyers.
And the non-tariff barrier we're talking about is India's position on genetically modified crops. Right.
Exactly. India's got a ban on importing genetically modified products, and this directly affects GM corn and soybean. Since a huge chunk of the corn and soybean grown in the U.S. is genetically modified, engineered to resist pests or herbicides, this ban basically blocks U.S. supplies from entering the Indian market.
So there's a good chance the U.S. is going to push India to relax these restrictions, particularly the ban on GM corn and soybean in any upcoming trade talks.
Absolutely. Getting those tariff barriers lowered, and maybe even more importantly, getting some flexibility on that non-tariff barrier on GM imports are probably going to be top priorities for the U.S. as they try to get a bigger piece of India's agricultural market. This could become a big sticking point in trade discussions.
Let's switch gears now and talk about cotton. It seems like India's situation has flipped completely, going from a big exporter to needing to import. What's going on there?
It's a pretty noticeable change. India's cotton production peaked back in 2013-14 at 39.8 million bales. But projections for the 2024-25 season are showing a steep drop to just 29.9 million bales, which is a 16-year low. This decline in production is a big deal for a country that's historically been a major player in the global cotton market.
And what are the main reasons for this big drop in India's cotton output?
The report points to two major factors. First, India hasn't approved any new genetically modified cotton varieties since 2006. And second, the existing bleat cotton hybrids, where bleat stands for Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a naturally occurring bacterium whose genes are put into the cotton to make it resistant to certain pests. Well, they're showing more and more resistance to major pests like the pink bollworm and whitefly. This increasing pest resistance is really hitting crop yields.
So with production at home going down, India's now become a net importer of cotton. The projected numbers for imports and exports are pretty striking.
Yeah, for the 2024-25 season, India's cotton imports are projected to be around 3 million bales, while its exports are only expected to be 1.7 million bales. This turnaround from being a net exporter to a net importer has big implications for India's textile industry and its overall trade balance. So we're seeing India potentially needing to import more cotton on top of a lot more feed. Could this create some conflict, in terms of how land's used or what the priorities are in agriculture to address both of these needs? It's a really important question for India's agricultural planning.
Now let's bring the U.S. back into the picture. They've historically been a leading exporter of cotton worldwide.
Right. The U.S. has always been one of the top cotton exporting countries globally, although Brazil did overtake them in exports for the 2023-24 season, but the U.S. is still a major exporter, and India, with its increasing need for cotton imports, presents a potential market for them, especially considering India's own production decline.
Do we have any specific figures on how much cotton the U.S. has been exporting to India in recent years?
We do. In 2022, the value of U.S. cotton exports to India was $491.2 million. This dropped to $231.2 million in 2023, and projections for 2024 are at about $210.7 million. While there's been a downward trend, those numbers still represent a pretty substantial trade flow.
And what about import duties on cotton in India? Are they as high as those on corn and soybean?
Actually, the import duty on cotton in India is relatively low at just 11%. This lower tariff, along with India's growing need for cotton imports, suggests there's potential for the U.S. to bump up its cotton exports to India, assuming they can stay competitive on price and quality with other exporting countries.
It seems like this greater access to U.S. cotton could be a good thing for India's textile industry, which is a big exporter of garments itself.
That's a good point. India's textile industry, which, as the Hindu report mentioned, exported $10.8 billion worth of garments to the U.S. in 2024, could definitely benefit from having raw cotton imports more readily available, maybe even at lower duty rates in the future. This would really boost their competitiveness on the global market.
Okay, so to sum up everything we've talked about, it seems the U.S. sees a big opportunity in India's agricultural sector with the rising demand for corn and soybean for animal feed and the need for more cotton imports. But whether they can make the most of this opportunity really comes down to whether India is willing to rethink its tariff policies and its stance on importing genetically modified crops.
Exactly. How India's own agricultural import policies evolve, influenced by things like declining cotton production, rising feed needs because of changing diets and broader economic factors, is going to have a major effect on global agricultural trade in the coming years. And the U.S. is definitely positioning itself to capitalize on these changes.
It's a pretty complex mix of domestic agricultural needs, trade policies, and international pressure. It really highlights how interconnected the global agricultural market is.
Totally. And for all of you getting ready for your UPSC exams, understanding these dynamics, the underlying reasons for India's shifting agricultural import needs, and the geopolitical context of trade negotiations with a major player like the US is super important for both your preliminary and main examinations. These are the kinds of interconnected issues that often form the basis of those insightful questions.
So for all you UPSC aspirants out there, let's go over the key takeaways one more time. India is looking at a substantial increase in demand for feed ingredients like corn and soybean in the next few years. The U.S. is very interested in meeting this demand, and they also want to capitalize on India's current need for cotton imports. But existing tariffs and non-tariff barriers, especially India's ban on GM crops, are big roadblocks. And we can't forget about the shift in India's cotton market from a net exporter to a net importer. All of these things are connected and will definitely have a big impact on India's economy and its trade relationships, particularly with countries like the U.S. And just so you know, all this information we've been discussing today is based on a recent report highlighted in the Hindu fed you, so you've got a solid and reliable source for your further reading and UPSC preparation.
And this brings us to a really important point for you all to think about. Given that India needs to find a balance between its domestic agricultural interests, the growing demand for food and feed, and the pressures of international trade, what do you think are the most likely changes we'll see in India's agricultural import policies over the next few years? And how might those changes ultimately affect India's food security, the livelihoods of its farmers, and its overall economic growth? It's a complex issue with some pretty big long-term implications.
We really hope this deep dive into India's evolving farm market has given you some valuable insights and something to think about as you prep for your UPSC exams, especially for your daily current affairs study. To keep up with more important topics that are super relevant for your exams, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and leave your comments and questions down below. We always appreciate you engaging with us.
As we mentioned, the core information for this episode is from a recent report covered in the Hindu. Make sure you check it out for a more detailed perspective.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you then.